Years ago, I was asked by a Lucchese captain, Dom Trusello, if I could drive him and Gambino captain Vincent Jimmy Balls Beltempo up to the Lucchese Social Club in the Bronx. During the car ride, Dom and Jimmy, who were childhood friends, were joking and reminiscing about the old days, and we laughed the entire trip. One of the guys they mentioned was someone named Chalutz, and Jimmy was reminding Dom stories about him. I wish I could remember them, but I was concentrating on driving and only remember some of what they said. One of the things they both agreed upon was that everybody feared him, and it was believed that he killed about 30 people. Fast forward to me entering the podcast world. I would have liked to cover the guy they spoke of, but only knew him by his nickname. There's been some posts recently which mention the name Charles Gagliodotto, nicknamed Chalutz. So with the little research, here's what I could share. Former Lucchese acting boss, Al Diaco, referred to Gagliodotto as a pint-sized Boris Karloff, but added that no one would dare kid with him. He was a Mad Hatter, a stone killer, and people were deathly scared of him. This seemed to be a common feeling when it came to Gagliodotto. One confidential FBI informant told his handler that in the 1960s, Gagliodotto and his partner Little Davy were two of the most feared members in all of the Italian mafia. Charles Gagliodotto was just over 5 feet in height, and his partner in the street, David Petillo, also known as Little Davy, was just a few inches taller. Both their arrest records date back to the 1920s, and they were both associated to Giosuo Aiello, boss of the 4th Ward on the Lower East Side. Gagliodotto would be involved in an incident that displayed his personality. On August 22, 1925, New York City patrolman David Sheehan happened to walk in a wine shop on Rivington Street where a robbery was in progress. 3 young men were holding up 6 people. When Sheehan went to reach for his gun, one of the would-be robbers shot him in his head. And it was Gagliodotto who was believed to fire that fatal shot that killed patrolman Sheehan. His 2 accomplices were arrested for the crime the following year on July 26, 1926. Petillo is said to have almost 20 arrests dating from 1919 to 1934. Both he and Gagliodotto had a unique style when committing murders. They would disguise themselves by dressing like women. In fact, Petillo had been dressing like a woman since a young age, which naturally caused rumors that he was gay, and the reason why he left New York in 1926 and headed to Chicago, where he became associated to Al Capone and often acted as one of his bodyguards. Around this time, Petillo and Gagliodotto were committing hits for bosses around the country, sometimes both dressed like women, and on other occasions, Gagliodotto would dress normal and pose as Petillo's date. In one instance, Petillo played the role of a shoeshine boy, and when his target came out of a social club, he decided to get a shoeshine. Petillo reached in his shine box, pulled out a pistol, and shot the target. During another hit, the duo dressed like women, all in black, posing as mourners, and joined the funeral procession. Their target was in attendance, and at some point, they climbed into a funeral car, which the target was riding in, and shot him to death. They then slipped away with their pistols out of view, tucked away in their pocketbooks. When Petillo returned to New York in 1931, he and Gagliodotto joined forces with Lucky Luciano. That same year, bosses Salvatore Maranzano and Joe Mazzaria were eliminated, leaving Luciano to lead organized crime in New York. Besides the traditional rackets, Petillo and Gagliodotto were heavily involved in narcotics, both selling and using. They were known to use opium, and Gagliodotto would become addicted to heroin. According to reports, Petillo was inducted in the 1930s by Luciano. During that same time, the Luciano family entered the world of prostitution. And following the New York City Police Department conducting over 200 raids on brothels in February 1936, over 100 people were arrested, 87 of which were women, and 3 prostitutes began talking to law enforcement. They implicated Luciano as the ringleader and also stated that they reported to Petillo. Both men were arrested as a result. The trial began in May of 1936, and by June, both were convicted, and Luciano received a 30 to 50-year sentence, and Petillo was sentenced 25 to 40 years. In January 1946, Luciano had his sentence commuted in exchange for his aid during World War II. The following month, in February 1946, Luciano was released from prison and deported to Italy. Petillo remained incarcerated until June 1955. When he was released, Luciano's underboss, Vito Genovese, placed him in Mike Miranda's downtown crew. A few years earlier, in September 1949, Gagliodotto and Michael Catone were arrested by New York City narcotic agents and the city police. They were observed exchanging packages on the corner of Mott and Spring Street. The police seized 5 kilos of opium that was wrapped in grease-proof paper and tied with linen. After the opium was tested, it was believed it came from Turkey. In 1958, Petillo and Gagliodotto would be indicted in a major narcotics case that involved the importation of $90 million worth of narcotics that came from Canada. They wanted to create a wholesale network, which involved John Armento, Carmine Galante, and Anthony Mira, just to name a few. Both Petillo and Gagliodotto were severed from that case for some reason, and there's only mention of Petillo receiving a 9-year sentence. A February 2nd, 1965 FBI report stated that Gagliodotto, FBI number 59036, is a prominent member of the Genovese family. However, unlike Petillo, there's no indication when he was actually inducted. Gagliodotto would commit his last 2 murders in 1968, murders that would ultimately lead to his demise. At the time, he was involved in a narcotics deal with Frank Gangi Sr. and Frank Tuminero, whose brother Little Angelo was a Lucchese member and considered the mastermind behind the French connection. There was a falling out between the 3 men, which caused Gagliodotto to lose $17,000, and he suspected that they were cheating him. A subsequent sit-down took place, and supposedly, Gagliodotto lost that decision. So on August 9, 1968, he invited Gangi and Tuminero for a drink at a social club located on Mott and Elizabeth Street. Some reports state that he poured them drinks, but how can anyone really know that? Nonetheless, at some point, he pulled a pistol out and killed them both. He then placed their bodies in the trunk of a car and drove them to Sullivan County, New York, where he dumped their bodies at Rooster Gap Road in Bloomingburg. Gagliodotto knew the area because he had a summer home close by. Naturally, it didn't take long for little Angelo Tuminero to figure out who was responsible for killing his brother. He went to the Genovese administration and demanded that Gagliodotto be killed. The administration agreed with him and ordered his murder. And who better to use to kill him than his childhood friend and partner in crime, David Petillo. Petillo, along with his nephew, Eddie Chicky Vassallo, took a nighttime stroll with Gagliodotto on Prince Street. It's believed that Vassallo grabbed Gagliodotto, who at the time was 60 years old, from behind and held him, while Petillo placed a plastic bag over his head and strangled him. They dumped his body outside 2110 33rd Street in Astoria, Queens, far enough away from Little Italy, where he was killed. After discovering his body, it was taken to the Queen's medical examiner, who ruled the death as natural causes and released the body to his family. The FBI received a tip from an informant who told them Gagliodotto didn't die of natural causes, but was rather murdered. The agents rushed to the Pasquale Alavecchio funeral parlor on Mott Street, where Gagliodotto was being laid out. They took custody of his body and had it re-examined by a chief medical examiner who concluded he died of strangulation. In 1979, Petillo began having problems with his nephew Vassallo. The two were in business together, and Petillo felt he was holding back on the profits. They owned the Egyptian Health Spa and 2 adult bookstores. Initially, Petillo tried going the legal route, but couldn't get any satisfaction through the courts. So he decided to kill Vassallo, and oddly enough, told his sister, who was dying of cancer, that he wouldn't kill her son, his nephew, while she was still alive. She would die in December 1979. Please remember to like this video if you haven't already, as it helps with the algorithm. And for anyone who wants to show their appreciation for videos like this or help keep this podcast going, you can do so by the Super Thanks icon down below or the PayPal Cash App links in the video's description. When Petillo ordered Vassallo's murder, he and his wife flew to Switzerland the first week of February 1980, obviously creating an alibi. On February 4th, 1980, a 3-man hit team entered Vassallo's Brick, New Jersey home and shot him 5 times. Miraculously, he didn't die, but spent the next 10 days in the hospital and died on February 14, 1980, as a result of his injuries. Petillo and his three co-defendants would all be indicted for the murder, but Petillo never returned to the U.S. and would himself die of a heart attack on December 28, 1983, while hiding in Spain.